I went on deck, and there I heard voices say, "It is all right. We've only struck a vessel." And looking around, I saw several lights some distance off on our starboard beam. I think there were 3 lights. I do not think they were colored lights, but didn't pay much attention to them. I went back into the cabin and was about to turn in when I noticed her taking a heavy list to port, and then thought she was going down and went on deck. I heard someone say, "She's making water very fast forward." I went forward to the pilot house and there heard the purser ask the captain what boat he should take charge of. I didn't hear the answer. I asked the captain if there were no blue lights or a gun. He told me I could find blue lights in the pilot house. The captain was at that time coming out of his own room, and I did not see him after that. I then, with another man, whom I didn't know, went into the pilot house, found 6 blue lights, and set 5 of them off. I then noticed that the engines were still working, but no one was at the wheel. I then went on deck to the starboard side, forward of the paddle box where a number of the men were trying to get the longboat out, but they couldn't do it. I then went to see about the port boat forward and helped 5 or 6 ladies into it and tried to get the boat off, but we couldn't budge the boat. There were about 20 ladies on the boat. I then heard it said that the 2 boats abaft the wheels had gotten off, but I didn't see them. The boat I was near was partly full of water, and we could not get her off at all. I think it was about an hour from the time the steamer struck up to the time when she listed to port, so much that the port boat was led into the water and cut loose from the davits. I was in this boat, which, when it touched the water, begun to till and turned over. I crawled upon the bottom of the boat and helped several others up with me. What you just heard are the words of Henry Frederick Jelly, one of only 2 survivors of the SS Pacific, which went down on November 4th, 1875. The SS Pacific, today, on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Hello and welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, tales of mishaps, misfortune, and misadventure. Thank you so much for listening. The waters off the northwest coast of the United States and southwest coast of Canada are nicknamed the Graveyard of the Pacific and stretch from the mouth of the Columbia River in Oregon to the northern tip of Vancouver Island in British Columbia. Since 1972, over 2,000 ships and roughly 1,500 lives have been lost. These waters are particularly tricky due to the currents of the Columbia River in Oregon and the Strait of Juan de Fuca separating the U.S. and Canada. Sand and silt from the rivers get deposited when it reaches the Pacific, forming unpredictable and shifting sandbars stretching for miles. It's a challenging waterway, even for experienced mariners. The SS Pacific was an 876-ton sidewheel paddle steamer built in 1850. She was commissioned by the team of Major Albert Lowry, Captain Nathaniel Jarvis, and William H. Brown, and built at Brown Shipyard on the East River in New York City. She was 223 feet in length, had a beam of 33.5 feet, had a hull made from oak, 1 single funnel, 2 coal-fired boilers, and 3 masts. She was built as a passenger and cargo steamer with a capacity of 576 passengers and 52 crew. The Pacific had 2 classes of accommodations for its passengers, featuring individual cabins and a dining salon for first class, and steerage with communal accommodations in common areas and a separate mess area for dining. The ship launched on September 24, 1850, and the following day performed her sea trials to much acclaim. Part owner Captain Nathaniel Jarvis guided her down the East River, even racing 2 other new ships, the Franklin and the Asia, easily outpacing them, reaching a speed of 16 knots. On board were VIP guests including shipbuilder William H. Brown, exiled President of Venezuela General José Antonio Páez, many other ship captains, and members of the public. She returned to her berth after a highly successful 85-mile round trip. Just a couple weeks later, on October 11, 1850, the Pacific embarked on her maiden voyage, setting the single-day speed record for travel down the east coast of the United States. She was bound for Havana and then New Orleans, carrying 80 passengers. She arrived on October 23rd and was put into service carrying passengers between New Orleans, Havana, and Chagres, Panama for the Pacific Steamship Mail Company. After a short time, the ship was purchased by American tycoon Cornelius Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt made a fortune in railroads and regional shipping companies, and he envisioned the Pacific taking passengers, mail, and cargo from New York to San Francisco. The Panama Canal was still over 60 years away from existence, and steaming around Cape Horn was not a viable option. At this time, the fastest route to California was to take a steamer to Panama, crossing 60 miles of the isthmus. Canoes were used, followed by an overland mule trail, and then passengers would board another steamer for San Francisco. Eventually, short draft steamers replaced the canoes, and by 1855, a railroad replaced the mule trail. But it remained an arduous journey in the stifling tropical heat of Panama. To make this trip faster and hopefully cheaper, Vanderbilt planned on building a canal through Nicaragua. However, funding for the canal never materialized. Instead, he used a route up the San Juan River to Lake Nicaragua and then overland through the jungle on old Spanish trails to the Pacific, with mule teams carrying baggage. However, this route did not go as planned, as officials in Nicaragua levied a number of unexpected fees, angering passengers. In addition, the hot and humid conditions, filth, vermin, and malaria made the travel experience quite miserable. In fact, Captain David G. Bailey died while in port at San Juan del Sur, causing Nathaniel Jarvis to temporarily take over as captain. Vanderbilt was able to smooth over some of these difficulties with the Nicaraguans, and the SS Pacific served the Nicaragua to San Francisco portion of the route for several years. But the situation in Nicaragua remained quite unstable. In 1854, when locals attempted to once again extort additional and unexpected port fees, one of Vanderbilt's employees was kidnapped, resulting in a U.S. diplomat arriving on the scene. After the diplomat had his face slashed with a broken bottle, the USS Cyane bombarded the town, effectively destroying it. This did nothing to help Vanderbilt. A civil war erupted in Nicaragua, destabilizing the entire region, and Vanderbilt's possessions were seized. The SS Pacific operated between Nicaragua and San Francisco as tensions mounted until 1855, when it became an untenable situation. The ship was withdrawn from service at that time and was laid up. In 1858, the Pacific was purchased by the Merchants Accommodation Line, carrying mostly passengers and cargo between San Francisco and Portland, Oregon. The ship was used extensively by miners traveling along the coast during the gold rush. The Pacific carried on with this service, and on July 18, 1861, she was outbound on the Columbia River from Portland to Astoria under Captain George W. Staples. She chugged away at 12 knots in a particularly heavy fog at around 2 a.m. when the ship struck a promontory called Coffin Rock. The bow was severely damaged and the ship quickly flooded. Captain Staples was able to steer her down the river for another 10 miles or so before beaching the ship on the Washington side of the river. The stern was submerged and much of the cargo was destroyed, but all 70 passengers plus the crew were safely evacuated. On August 2nd, the steamer Express arrived on the scene with a fire truck, which pumped the water from the flooded ship, and she was refloated. She was sent first to Astoria for repairs and then to San Francisco for additional refitting and repairs. In 1863, the Pacific was purchased by the Oregon and San Diego Steamship Company and primarily served up and down the northwest United States. In 1867, the ship was sold to the Oregon and California Steamship Company and returned to her San Francisco to Portland route, but with an additional stop at Victoria, British Columbia. 5 years later, in 1872, she was sold to the Pacific Mail Steamship Company and placed on their southern runs from San Diego to Mexico. In the early 1870s, gold deposits were discovered in the Stikine River in northern British Columbia, which increased the demand for travel to that area. In January of 1875, the Pacific was again sold to the Goodall, Nelson, and Perkins Steamship Company and placed on the northern route between Portland and Puget Sound. The new owners gave her what appeared to be an extensive overhaul and announced the ship had been completely rebuilt and refit. In actuality, most of the repairs were merely cosmetic. Steamship companies were in the midst of rate wars, routinely undercutting each other to attract more customers in a very competitive industry. Perhaps a useful tactic, but as a result, reduced rates also meant reduced profits. In order to maximize profits, these steamship companies cut corners wherever they could, often at the expense of safety. Nevertheless, the Pacific was certified as safe by Robert H. Waterman of the U.S. Steamboat Inspection Service. In her new configuration, she was licensed to carry 203 passengers, 115 in first class, 88 in second class, plus a crew of 52. Not surprisingly for the time, she only carried 5 lifeboats with a capacity for just 160 people. The ship welcomed a new skipper as well, Captain Jefferson Davis Howell, who happened to be the brother-in-law of Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederate States of America. He served in the Civil War, fought for the Confederacy, fled and returned to the U.S. several times after the war, and was arrested several times before ending up in San Francisco. In April of 1875, the SS Pacific was again ready to return to service and began taking passengers and cargo along her familiar route between San Francisco, Portland, Tacoma, Seattle, and Victoria. On Thursday, November 4, 1875, she was preparing to depart from Esquimalt on Vancouver Island, British Columbia. Tons of cargo were being loaded, including 300 bales of hops, 2,000 sacks of oats, animal hides, 280 tons of coal, 28 tons of general merchandise, furs, barrels of cranberries, 2 horses and buggies, 2 cases of opium, and a strongbox containing almost $80,000 in cash. The number of passengers on board this day is difficult to pinpoint. 35 passengers boarded in Puget Sound, another 132 in Victoria, and the onboard purser sold at least 20 more tickets to walk-up passengers, and even more ran aboard just moments before departure. Children who sailed for free were unaccounted for. Eyewitnesses, including those who worked on the dock, claim there were between 250 and 275 passengers at least, and some estimated at least 300 or more. Among the passengers were quite a few prominent businessmen from Victoria, an equestrian troupe, 41 Chinese laborers, and a large number of miners with pocketfuls of gold they had found in British Columbia. It is estimated about $100,000 worth of gold was on board. That's about $3 million in 2023 money. Although he was already 30 minutes behind schedule, Captain Howell slowly slipped his vessel out of Victoria Harbor at approximately 9:30 a.m. and into the Strait of Juan de Fuca, separating Vancouver Island from the state of Washington. By 4 o'clock p.m., she had reached Tatoosh Island off of Cape Flattery at the extreme northwest tip of Washington. The Cape Flattery Lighthouse was a crucial beacon for this highly trafficked waterway. As Captain Howell looked out into the open ocean, he saw ominous swells and whitecaps, and a southerly headwind reduced the Pacific's speed. By 8 o'clock p.m., she was 12 miles off the Washington coast and 30 miles south of Cape Flattery, heading south. It was a dark night, even darker than usual because of the clouds. A southerly wind blew directly at them while a fine rain came down around them. The ship was consistently listing to starboard, most likely due to an overcrowded and unbalanced ship. Captain Howell ordered the port side lifeboats to be filled with water until the list was corrected. When it was overcorrected, water would be added to the starboard side boats. Survivor Henry F. Jelly stated, "During the day, the crew were constantly pumping water into the boats to keep the steamship on an even keel, first on one side and then on the other, and she would list to either side alternately." The Pacific had only 3 inexperienced crewmen on duty that evening, the helmsman, third mate, and a lookout. She was operating with only one masthead light, which was legal at the time. In 1875, U.S. maritime law required all vessels to have one or more lights, but the color and location of the lights was not specified. At the same time, the Orpheus, a 200-foot-long, fully rigged sailing ship, was sailing north up the Washington coast with the wind at about 12 knots. She was a trading vessel on her way to Nanaimo, British Columbia. At 9:30 p.m., Captain Charles A. Sawyer left the bridge to a second mate, James G. Allen. Before leaving for the chart room, Sawyer gave instructions to Allen to head offshore to the northwest if he encountered anything. As the Orpheus continued north, second mate Allen did see something, and reported what he believed to be Cape Flattery Lighthouse off the port bow. The ship was turned hard to port, as would be necessary based on the position of the lighthouse. By the time Captain Sawyer realized the light was an oncoming vessel and not the lighthouse, it was too late. Captain Sawyer, who had been joined on the deck by his wife Lillian, watched the accident unfold as the Pacific continued to steam directly for them. He shouted to the steamer to yield, but there was no response. The Orpheus was directly in the path of the Pacific and moving very slowly, almost dead in the water. Within moments, the Pacific collided with the Orpheus at an angle on the starboard side, destroying her foremast rigging. The Pacific tore down the starboard side of the Orpheus, ramming her 2 more times, tearing away most of the rigging, smashing the side planks, destroying about 40 feet of railing. The Pacific, having bounced and smashed its way down the helpless Orpheus, passed astern of the smaller ship. Sawyer's wife, who saw the entire accident, was furious. She made an attempt to board the Pacific before the ships drifted apart, but fortunately, Sawyer was able to prevent her from doing so. Captain Howell on the Pacific was jolted out of bed by the collision. He rushed to the bridge where he saw the lights of a sailing ship drifting away in the distance. It was quickly apparent to him that his ship was taking on water. The ship's crew scrambled to launch lifeboats, pumps were activated, and passengers began gathering on the deck in a panic. Henry F. Jelly, whose words you heard at the beginning of this episode, was one of the passengers on the deck after the collision. Returning to his cabin, he realized the ship was listing badly to starboard. He left his cabin again, making it to the pilot house with another passenger, where he found and fired off 5 of the blue light signal flares. He then made for the nearest lifeboat on the starboard side and found several men struggling to get it launched. Jelly tried the port side and climbed into a lifeboat with mostly women. The lifeboat was lowered, but because it had been half filled with water earlier in the day, it immediately was swamped by the waves and capsized. Jelly and 4 men managed to climb on the bottom of the overturned boat and watched helplessly as the women, who were weighted down by their clothing, disappeared under the water. By this time, the Pacific was no more. The old steamer broke in half and vanished under the waves. Modern estimates put the loss of life at around 325. Jelly and 1 other man abandoned the capsized lifeboat and grabbed onto a piece of the pilot house. Henry Jelly later wrote of this, "We held onto a copper wire that came out of the top. Next morning got some life preservers floating near the house, and with their ropes, lashed myself and my comrade onto the house. I and my comrade were on the top of the pilot house all of the 5th until about 4 o'clock p.m., when he died and I cut him loose. The sea was running high all day, and I think my comrade was drowned by the waves washing over him, he not being strong enough to hold his head up and the waves constantly washing over us." After 2 days adrift on the wreckage, Jelly was carried off into the Strait of Juan de Fuca, in visual sight of Vancouver Island. He did his best to hold on, knowing this was a well-traveled shipping lane. Finally, at 10 o'clock a.m., a lookout aboard the bark Messenger spotted Jelly and picked him up. He was taken to Port Townsend, where he reported the collision of the 2 ships, which was still unknown at the time. The U.S. Revenue Cutter Service, a precursor to the U.S. Coast Guard, immediately sent the cutter Oliver Wolcott to the scene to look for survivors and wreckage. Henry Jelly was one of only 2 survivors of the wreck of the SS Pacific. The other was the ship's quartermaster, Neil Henley. Henley was jarred awake from his bed, finding water rushing into the bow of the ship, quickly flooding the crew's quarters. Henley rushed to the deck, where he saw the green starboard light of the Orpheus. He attempted to help lower lifeboats, but panicked passengers blocked his efforts. Two of the lifeboats were almost entirely filled with water and were completely useless. Some lifeboats didn't have oars, and others were missing their plugs. Henley managed to launch one lifeboat and quickly boarded it. He was joined by 15 women and 6 men. As their lifeboat was lowered, it crashed against the side of the ship and capsized, throwing all its occupants into the water. As Henley scrambled to find anything to hold onto, he watched the Pacific snap in half and disappear. He found a piece of the hurricane deck with 7 other people holding onto it, including Captain Howell. The accident happened on a Thursday, and Henley and the other survivors desperately held on throughout Friday. As the weather and waves worsened, powerful waves began washing away some of the survivors, including Captain Howell. One here, another there, and another died from exposure. By Saturday morning, Henley was alone on the makeshift raft. Attempts at signaling passing ships were ineffective, as he was just too far away. Fortunately, he was able to acquire a wooden packing crate that was floating by, and he used it for just a little bit of shelter from the wind, sun, and rain. After 78 hours adrift on the wreckage, Neil Henley was spotted by a lookout on the Oliver Wolcott, and he was rescued. Following the collision, Captain Sawyer of the Orpheus gave his full attention to saving his ship and his crew. After inspecting the damage and checking the hull, he discovered that it was intact and free of water. The Orpheus was badly damaged, most notably her rigging, but she was in no danger of sinking. As the crew of the Orpheus settled in for damage control and repairs, Captain Sawyer looked for the ship that had hit her. Seeing nothing in any direction, he was convinced the ship had steamed off without even offering assistance. He and the crew managed to get some of the sails partially flying again, and the ship began limping north at 2 knots. By the next evening, all repairs were done and the Orpheus set out for the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Unknown to the captain, the Orpheus had already drifted north past the strait. He mistook the newly constructed Cape Beale Lighthouse for the Cape Flattery Lighthouse to the south. In fact, the captain and crew of the Orpheus had no knowledge of the new lighthouse. On Saturday, November 6th, the Orpheus turned into Barkley Sound, believing it to be the strait, and ran aground on Tarsus Island. There were no casualties, but the hull was compromised, and the ship was a total loss. First Nations people in that area, along with the owner of several trading outposts named Captain Andrew Lang, provided food and shelter for the crew and passengers. Tents were made on shore using the canvas sails from the ship. Captain Sawyer wanted to send a canoe to Victoria to send for help, but the harsh weather prevented any such attempts. While waiting for rescue, the crew stripped the Orpheus of anything valuable. After rescuing Henry Jelly and bringing him to Port Townsend, the cutter Oliver Wolcott headed back out, north, up the west coast of Vancouver Island, to look for more survivors. But bad weather hampered efforts for several days into Wednesday, November 10th. As the cutter was heading to Barkley Sound, a lookout spotted a canoe with 6 native people and the first mate of the Orpheus. They were attempting to make it to Victoria in order to send rescue ships. The cutter was guided to the survivors' makeshift village, and they were picked up and taken to Port Townsend. Neil Henley and Henry Jelly miraculously survived the ordeal through sheer willpower and determination. All others on board, estimated to be about 325, perished. Other vessels were soon sent to search the area for survivors, bodies, or any evidence of the wreck. Only about 20 bodies were ever found, which had washed up on nearby beaches. Captain Sawyer was subsequently arrested in Canada, and a coroner's inquest into the wreck was launched on November 24, 1875, in Victoria, British Columbia. The investigation focused on the case of a San Francisco man named Thomas J. Farrell, whose body was found in Canada. Witnesses included some of the crew of the Orpheus, as well as Henry Jelly and Neil Henley. Captain Sawyer did not appear in court, fearing he would be arrested again by Canadian officials. Additional witnesses familiar with the SS Pacific also appeared and testified to the poor condition of the ship. The captain of the cutter Oliver Wolcott, a Lieutenant Harwood, described the damage to the Orpheus and that he found a portion of the Pacific's bow entangled in the rigging of the Orpheus, further illustrating the delicate condition of the Pacific. After 2 days, the jury determined the collision was caused by the Orpheus crossing the path of the Pacific. But much blame was also placed on the captain and officers of the Pacific, believing they did not do enough to avoid the collision, calling them incompetent and negligent of their duties. But Captain Howell and the other officers were gone, and unable to defend themselves. The inquiry found the SS Pacific itself was unsafe, claiming it should not have sunk so easily or so quickly had it been a safe vessel. The number of lifeboats and their poor condition were also blamed for the inability to save more passengers. The jury ultimately found Captain Sawyer guilty of manslaughter and for leaving the scene without offering assistance, although he was not apprehended in Canada and never faced these charges in a Canadian court. In January of 1876, Captain Sawyer faced U.S. federal charges in San Francisco for running the Orpheus aground. Some believed he willfully destroyed the ship to get rid of any evidence of the collision. He was charged with barratry, a somewhat archaic term for fraud or gross negligence of a ship's master or crew at the expense of its owners. Sawyer testified that he was unaware of the Cape Beale lighthouse and claimed it did not appear on any of his charts. His defense argued that Sawyer did not willfully or maliciously destroy any property. Captain J.T. Gilkey of the Messenger, which rescued Henry Jelly, testified that he was also unaware of the new lighthouse, and he very nearly made the same mistake just a few weeks earlier. Ultimately, there was not enough evidence to convict Sawyer, and the charges were dropped. During Sawyer's hearing, a secret inquiry was held by the U.S. Steamboat Inspection Service District Office in San Francisco. Captain Robert H. Waterman was one of 2 men presiding over the hearing. Ironically, it was Waterman who inspected the Pacific and certified it as seaworthy and safe. The secrecy of the hearing was widely criticized by the newspapers. Ultimately, the inquiry found Captain Sawyer at fault for turning his ship across the bow of the Pacific, but were unable to explain or account for the Pacific being unable to avoid the collision. The 2 inspectors absolved Sawyer of any intentional disregard of the duties of humanity, but harshly criticized him, blaming him for the massive loss of life. Not surprisingly, no blame was placed on the inspection service, citing the thorough inspection of the Pacific's hull just days before she re-entered service, by none other than Waterman himself, and found the ship to be perfectly safe. Ultimately, the inquiry wrapped up their report by claiming it made no difference whether the Pacific was in excellent or poor condition, and the outcome would have been the same. Even if this were true, and that is questionable, having the inspector of the Pacific presiding over the inquiry of its sinking was bad optics and did not engender trust from the public. Captain Sawyer was eventually given command of another vessel and continued his career into the late 1880s and settled into retirement with his family. Just a few years after retiring, he began suffering from heart trouble, and he died on October 6, 1894, of congestive heart failure. Following his rescue, Neil Henley had an active and interesting life, performing a variety of jobs, including serving on the ship that saved him, the Oliver Wolcott. He also was a town marshal, a gold prospector, prison guard, and served as a quartermaster during the Spanish-American War. In 1899, he returned to work for the penitentiary and built a 24-foot sloop for mail and supply runs. He was promoted to superintendent of boats and created the first ever powerboat, the 46-foot John G. Sargent, a vessel that served the penitentiary for 50 years. He retired in 1921 and passed away in 1944. Henry F. Jelly returned to his home in Port Stanley, Ontario, was married in Ireland, and returned to Port Stanley, where he worked as a farmer and commercial fisherman. He died in 1930 at age 77. Friends of Captain Jefferson Davis Howell erected a 10-foot tall sandstone monument in his memory at the Seattle Masonic Cemetery. Etched on the monument are the words, Captain J.D. Howell, perished at sea on the steamship Pacific, November 4th, 1875, aged 34 years. The wreck of the Pacific was found nearly 150 years later in 2022 by Jeff Hummel and Matthew Macaulay, several miles south of Cape Flattery. Hummel began his search for the Pacific in 1993, and in 2017, a local fisherman showed him a piece of coal that he had brought up from that area. The coal was chemically analyzed and determined to be of the same era as the Pacific. Hummel and Macaulay's company, Rockfish Inc., was granted the legal rights to salvage what is left of the wreck of the Pacific. They used submersible drones to search the area. They discovered an octopus with its arms wrapped around a copper object. They knew they were in the vicinity of the wreck, and something made of copper almost certainly came from a ship. After 12 missions of searching, they found the wreck, including both paddle wheels which had separated from the ship and were located several hundred meters away. The Pacific lies 23 miles offshore, scattered in pieces ranging from 1,000 to 3,000 feet underwater, on a slope. In May of 2023, Rockfish announced plans for a series of salvage dives using their own custom-built remote underwater vehicles. It is estimated that $5 million worth of gold went down with the Pacific, in addition to the rest of its cargo. That's going to do it for the story of the SS Pacific. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you like the show, please remember to subscribe, rate, review, and tell a friend. More listeners helps the show grow, pay for hosting and equipment, and helps me bring better content to you. You can follow Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at ShipwrecksPod, and on Mastodon at shipwreckspod@c.im. Original theme music is by Sean Siegfried, and you can follow him on YouTube at Sean Secret or on the web at sean.siegfried.se. Please join me again in 2 weeks, and until then, don't forget to wear your life jackets.